Good morning, everyone. Thank you all for coming, and welcome to today's program, Can Municipalities Afford Public Employee Contracts? My name is Roberta Schaefer, and I'm the president of the Research Bureau, and we'd like to express our gratitude to the Mass College of Pharmacy and Health Sciences for hosting not only today's event, but many of the Research Bureau's events. We join the large chorus of those who thank Charlie Monahan for his generosity to our organization and for the transformative effect that the college has had on downtown Worcester. Today's program is part of the Research Bureau's Francis Harrington Forums on Municipal Government. We're grateful to our 2012 presenting sponsor, Commerce Bank, and our 2012 leadership sponsor, Polar Beverages, for providing support for this event. The Research Bureau also wishes to express its appreciation to the Telegram and Gazette for advertising today's event, as it does for all our events. And please be sure to visit our website at www.wrrb.org, where you can read and download Research Bureau reports as well as announcements of upcoming events and highlights from past events. And thanks to Penta Communications, which is in the process of arranging for videos of our forums to be seen through a link on our website. Quick reminder, the Research Bureau is now accepting nominations for the 2013 Thomas S. Green Public Service Awards. Now in its 25th year, these awards celebrate the unsung heroes working for the City of Worcester and other municipalities in Worcester County. And to learn more about the awards or to download a nomination form, please go to our website or call our office. The recession and its aftermath have laid bare the fiscal distress facing cities and states across the nation. This is the result of several factors. Pension fund investments that have lost value, making it more difficult to pay what is owed to retirees. The escalating cost of health insurance for current public employees, as well as health insurance of retirees, the liability for which has never been funded at all in most cases. The result is that a number of cities, such as Stockton, California, have declared bankruptcy, while some states, like Wisconsin, New Jersey, and Rhode Island, have tried to reform their benefit structure to put them on a more solid financial footing. Professor DiSalvo will elaborate on these themes and provide some insight on the long-term sustainability of taxpayer commitments to their public employees. Daniel DiSalvo is a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute Center for State and Local Leadership and an assistant professor of political science at the University of Virginia, and he was previously an Andrew Mellon visiting professor at Amherst College. Professor DiSalvo is a regular contributor on publicsectorinc.org, a project of the Manhattan Institute. His work focuses on American political parties, elections, labor unions, state government, and public policy. He has written on these topics for both scholarly and popular publications, including National Affairs, The Public Interest, The Weekly Standard, Commentary, The New York Daily News, The New York Post, The Forum, a journal of applied research in contemporary politics, The Tocqueville Review, Congress and the Presidency, and the Journal of Policy. The Journal of Policy History. Please join me in welcoming Daniel DiSalvo to Worcester.
Well, thank you, Roberta, for that very generous introduction. It's a pleasure to be in Worcester this morning on such a gorgeous fall day with the leaves and some of the gorgeous downtown old brick buildings I noticed on my walk over here from the hotel this morning. So it's a pleasure to be here. Let me get right into my remarks, and then I think with a group like this that's obviously well informed, the question and answer session should be lively and interesting. So, as Roberta was mentioning, everyone's really been familiar with these battles over public labor relations in states and cities throughout the country. It's since 2011. It's been covered widely in the press, and I think that for the first time really in their, say, 30 to 40 year existence, public employee unions are the subject of national attention. Since their creation in the 1960s and 1970s, unionized public employees have really operated beneath the radar of importance at the local level in cities and some state governments, but never really receiving the kind of national attention that the battle in Wisconsin, followed by other struggles in other states such as New York and California, and most recently between the mayor of Chicago, Rahm Emanuel, and his city's teachers' unions. So when we're considering the issue of public employment, the first thing to do is to think about who works for government and how so. So about only about a fifth of workers in the United States work for government directly or indirectly. So about 1 million workers work in the private sector, but only about 21 million work in the public sector, and the vast majority of those work at the state and local level. Excluding the military, there's only about 3 million people that work for the federal government. The vast majority of those workers at the state and local level are in elementary and secondary education. That's teachers, and teachers' unions are, of course, as we'll see, among the most powerful political forces related to education policy and most powerful political forces in the United States as a whole. Then you can see just in the chart the distribution of workers in other segments for the public. Now, when we consider, if that's the breakdown of where people work in public employment, then the issue is how many of them belong to unions. And here the trend line, I think, is interesting to note, which is that public employee unions didn't really exist in the United States prior to the 1960s, when states, in part following Wisconsin in 1959, began to pass laws facilitating collective bargaining, which led to the growth of unions in the government workforce. So by the late 70s, or you could say by 1980s, if you look at the green line in the chart, you can see that basically about between 35 and 40% of public employees across the country belong to unions, and that figure, that percentage, has remained remarkably stable over the last 30 or 40 years. You could say maybe it'll go down a point or 2 points, depending on what happens in Wisconsin, whether a few of the unions decide to decertify. But it's remained remarkably stable. On the other hand, the trend for membership in private sector unions, which had constituted until the 1960s the overwhelming percentage of workers who belonged to unions, has suffered a steep and quite dramatic decline, such that we can see, if we look at the character of union membership, by 2009, public employees constituted a majority of the unionized workforce in the United States. And in that regard, that's a striking change in who constitutes the members of the American labor movement. And if we're saying that 40% of American public employees at the state and local level belong to unions, that's not 40% in every state or every locality. The distribution is highly dispersed, which is to say it's much higher in some states and lower in others. In my current home state of New York, public employee unions represent roughly 70% of all public employees in the state. So that's the high rate is New York, and other states like California, about 57% of public employees belong to unions in California, down to some of the right-to-work states of the South, like North Carolina, or Virginia, where collective bargaining in the public sector is prohibited, you're talking in the single digits for public employee union membership. But I think the big thing to consider is this historical change. Many of us, or many people, many of my students, still have in their minds this notion that if I think of someone who belongs to a union, I think of someone in a hard hat and steel-toed boots with dirt under their nails that works in difficult conditions all day. The symbol of the iron worker, for example, carpenters and plumbers, and people working in heavy industry. But really, that's not the image that we should have in our minds when we think of union members today. Union members today are much probably better represented by thinking of teachers or other public employees. I myself in New York City am a public professor at a public university in the CUNY system, and there it's a agency shop, which means even if I don't join the union, I'm forced to pay agency fees into the union coffers. So I think the thing here is to distinguish, an important thing that's not often done in many of the press accounts, and in part there's strategic reasons for this, is to distinguish between public and private sector unions. Because on the one hand, they do share the union label, but I think they're in that sense they're of the same genus. But really, the two types of unions are really different species, and therefore they should be treated separately in serious analysis. Now, clearly they have a lot of things in common, which is why they're of the same genus. They both engage in collective bargaining. Both types of unions can and do charge fair share or agency shop fees, which, according to Supreme Court rulings, you can't be forced to become a union member. There's no such thing as a closed shop. But you can be forced to pay dues or fees to the union insofar as it acts as your agent in collective bargaining. And both can benefit from what's called a dues checkoff, which means that the employer, in the case of the public unions, the government entity, in the case of the private, the company or firm, deducts union dues directly from workers' paychecks and then sends them to the union. But I think that there are big differences and important differences between these two types of unions that really do make them different species. And those differences can be just, I think, captured under the headings of historical, economic, and political differences. And what we've already seen in the charts that I've shown you is that really public employee unions have had much less purchase on American political history than private sector unions. Private sector unions came into being in 1935 principally and had existed since the late 19th century, but really got a huge boost with the passage of the Wagner Act, which facilitated collective bargaining and unionization in the private sector. Public employee unions, on the other hand, very few belonged to unions really until the 1970s, and as we've seen, they didn't really get as fully established until the 1980s, and very few states and localities had collective bargaining laws for public employees before the 1960s. So by the 1980s, 33 states had some kind of collective bargaining laws, and almost all states have some collective bargaining laws for at least some public employees, except for about 3 states which prohibit entirely collective bargaining in the public sector. And I think if you look at AFSCME, and its growth and change in membership, if you look back to the New Deal period of when private sector unions are taking off and flourishing, AFSCME is hardly registering in terms of its membership. And if you look at it today, it's one of the largest unions in the country, outstripping many of what we usually consider to be the biggest private sector unions. And you can really see the takeoff coming right in the mid-1960s, where it more than doubles its membership. And I think the second big difference here, switching from the historical to the economic perspective, is what analysts have for a long time highlighted, the difference with public sector unions from their private sector counterparts is that they get two bites at the apple, meaning private sector unions can win things, better pay, benefits, and working conditions for their employees, really primarily or exclusively through collective bargaining. Whereas public employee unions can win things for their members both through collective bargaining and through the political process. For example, most pension schemes are not negotiated in collective bargaining, but there we can see the unions do exercise significant influence politically about what kind of pension schemes are offered. And in that regard, they also can exercise influence in what's sometimes called the being on both sides of the bargaining table in a way that their private sector counterparts could never imagine. Whether you're the stewardesses union at American Airlines or the auto workers unions at General Motors, you don't have much, if any, say over who is the CEO of American Airlines or of General Motors, which is different than public employee unions, which can involve themselves extensively in the political process through campaigning and lobbying, and have a significant influence of who's on the other side of the bargaining table. So the most famous recent instance of this was when Chris Christie in New Jersey was campaigning against his opponent, John Corzine. Corzine was the current governor. And Corzine got very excited at a rally for the communications workers of America, who represent a large number of public employees in his state. And he got a little overly enthusiastic, and he shouted out, "We're going to fight for a fair contract." Now, that would seem fine, except that Corzine in that instance would have been playing the position of management, not labor. And this is not something that's obscured. AFSCME puts it right on their website. We elect our bosses. So in that regard, their principal aim is to get involved in politics much more extensively than private sector unions, in part because the fate of their pay, benefits, and working conditions is much more tied to decisions of governors and legislators, mayors and city councils, than are those same things for private sector unions. Finally, you could say in the economic perspective, market forces are much more present in labor negotiations in the private sector. Over the long term, labor in the private sector has to be sensitive to the competitive position of their employers. If demands raise too much, they can ultimately bring the company down because it can't compete, it can't invest in research and development, it can't innovate in ways that make it more attractive than its competitors. Whereas government employee unions work for entities that almost never go out of business. And in part, that's why that percentage of public employees that remain unionized at about 35 to 40% is so stable, in part because government never goes out of business. And unions are never forced to keep reorganizing when in the churn of the private economy, when companies go out of business, private sector unions are forced to reorganize. And in that regard, it also takes away from any constraint on the demands of, or limits the constraints of demands that are made by public employee unions. So therefore, we should expect their demands to be less attuned in the public sector to issues of cost, productivity, and efficiency. So ultimately, I think you can say that public sector unions have 5 distinct advantages over their private sector counterparts, and even really over other interest groups. The first is that unlike other interest groups, whether that's the NEA or the Sierra Club or private sector unions, they have to fight for access to politicians. Public employee unions, through the collective bargaining process, have much more direct channels to get to access to politicians. Second, unlike other interest groups with a large membership, public employee unions can much more easily mobilize their membership because they share a common workplace, for, say, protests on the steps of the Capitol, or for get out the vote drives. Third, they have limited collective action problems. Again, take the Sierra Club or the NRA or other interest groups. They have to find people that care about guns and the environment and offer them a set of select incentives that will get them to donate their time and money to those groups. With agency shops and dues checkoff mechanisms, public employee unions can simply wait for the government to deduct the dues and send them a check in the mail. They have to dedicate few, if any, resources to fundraising of the type that other interest groups have. And in that regard, with the agency shop, they're also guaranteed, in effect, a large membership. And fourth, for the same reason, with dues checkoff, they're guaranteed, in a sense, a steady and stable revenue stream. Whereas other interest groups, you can imagine, their fundraising goes up and down, and the difficulties of raising money can be contingent on the state of the private economy. And fifth, the public employee unions benefit from a very close and intimate alliance with a major political party, primarily the Democratic Party, especially at the national level, although there's more variation at the state and local level. So if you look at the national level on the fifth point, of who have been the top political donors to candidates and parties, this doesn't include independent expenditures or parallel campaigns, over the last 25 years, you see that of the top 15, a healthy portion of those are public employee unions or unions like SEIU, which are about 50-50 public-private. And just to give you a sense of how that layout looks, this is the same data spliced a different way. You see that public employee unions donate overwhelmingly to the Democratic Party, or 90% or more of their dollars go to the Democratic Party at the national level, whereas corporations and businesses in the private sector tend to split their donations. If you look at Goldman Sachs, about 60% of its donations go to Democrats, 40% to Republicans. Citigroup, the American Medical Association, that represents primarily doctors, are splitting their contributions to both parties. And then, in addition to campaign donations to candidates and parties, public employees unions also engage in extensive lobbying efforts and have set up powerful lobbying shops in Washington and in many state capitals throughout the country. But I think that focusing just on national politics and national elections really misses where the action is, which is at the state and local level, and public employee unions can actually exercise their greatest influence on initiatives, referenda, off-cycle elections for school boards, and other obscure offices. For example, one scholar at Berkeley has found that where public employee unions, teachers unions in particular, where you have an off-cycle election for the school board, the teachers will be paid on average 3% more just by the result of the fact that the off-cycle election has such low turnout, and the teachers and their unions themselves constitute such a high percentage of the electorate. And you can see this in spending on initiatives. The unions easily outspent their opponents in Ohio to overturn Governor Kasich and the Republican state legislature's efforts to roll back collective bargaining in the state, and they easily outspent them almost 5-1. In California, about which I've just written a long report about the role of public employee unions in the states, which is available on the Manhattan Institute website in case people are curious, public employee unions have been involved in about 40% of all initiatives and ballot initiatives in California since 1980, and their record of wins and losses is quite striking. If they oppose a ballot initiative, there's 75% of those that they opposed were defeated, and of those that they favored, 50% of those they favored won, which is a pretty good record in American politics. Most interest groups rarely think that they bat 500. So, and you can see that in some sense the huge number where the unions really went to the mat in 2005 was where they spent over $90 million was to defeat a 3 referenda put on the ballot by Governor Schwarzenegger, which would have increased how difficult it was for teachers to get tenure, and a couple of other measures that affected union interests. All three of the major initiatives of the muscle man went down to defeat. And I think you can look at the state level and get a sense of just how powerful public employee unions are by looking at, if you put them together with general trade unions, carpenters, plumbers, and so on, they're going to be outspending the next four interests combined. In donations, these are direct donations to assembly candidates. That's obviously, this doesn't include their spending on independent expenditures or parallel campaigns, since those monies are harder to track. Similar, you see the same thing. They're even slightly inching out in 2008. Candidate self-finance, which is the main competitor. But you really, if you put together the two types of unions, they're going to be outspending lawyers and lobbyists. And then if you do include independent expenditures in California, the most powerful interest is probably the California Teachers Association, which over the last decade outspent the next three largest interest groups interests, pharmaceutical, real estate, and oil and gas in California. Over the last decade, outspent all three of those combined. So, what are the consequences of this power of public employee unions and of their differences from private sector unions and of other interest groups? Well, in part what's happened, and this isn't to lay all of this as at their door, is a transformation in work. In the way Americans work today, there's really become two worlds of work. In the private sector, it's a highly competitive, highly inegalitarian work environment. In the public sector, it's characterized by much more stability, much more predictability, and much greater wage compression, meaning those at the top end, managers, and those at the bottom are much closer in terms of salary. And second, public employee unions have used their advantages in electioneering, lobbying, and collective bargaining to make government more expensive. And the way that cost increases for government can come in different ways. States can end up with more debt. They can end up paying higher interest rates on their bonds. They can end up employing more workers, and they can spend more overall. And I think there's substantial evidence that each of these things happen if we look at both the scholarly and anecdotal evidence. So I'll give you some examples on the level of cities that if you look at cities, for example, there's a recent study by professors at Berkeley and Stanford that in cities after the unionization of firefighters, the firefighters did win good things for firefighters. That is, they won greater salaries. That's the whole purpose of the union, is to win better salaries, benefits, and working conditions for their members. That is, unionized firefighters made about 4% more after unionization than they did prior to it. Police officers made about 2.3% more. But total spending on fire and police increased substantially, 11% for firefighters and about 4% for police. So today, if you compare not just before and after unionization, but if you compare unionized firefighters with those that aren't, you see that they spend about 9% more per employee, per firefighter, on salary and about 25% more on benefits. So this has had some significant costs. An economist at Northwestern, Barry Bluestone, found that the price of state and local services over almost the last decade increased by about 41% nationally, compared with a much slower rate of increase of only 27% for private services. And in the similar findings that where if you have the agency shop is permitted or compulsory, that is, people can be forced to pay into union coffers, government workers' wages tend to be about 10% higher. And even if you're just not raising salary or costs, you can see that in 2007, O'Neill and McMahon found that the state or government entity can end up employing a lot more workers. So in New York, state and local government payrolls have gone far up, much faster than the private sector job growth rate in New York State. And one economist also found that you basically end up with, on average, about 20% more workers when you have strong public employee unions than you would in cities without them. If you turn to other costs that can be imposed, again, these are not often through collective bargaining, but usually through electioneering and lobbying. Ainsey and Moe again found that for each 10% increase in government unionization, the per capita pension liability in the state increased by almost $1,500. So if you take that math, you can see that moving from the least to the most unionized state, that is moving from North Carolina to New York, basically that means about almost $10,000 increase in the pension liabilities for every person in the state, or put differently, about 20% of the state's GDP. So not only is there a strong correlation here that's statistically significant between higher levels of government unionization and greater pension liabilities, but there's also a correlation between government employee unionization and the extent of underfunding. The more unionization you have, the greater likelihood that the pension plans at the state and city level will be underfunded. Not surprisingly, as a result of increases in benefits and increases in salaries, one economist, Richard Freeman at Harvard, finds that public employee unions are associated with greater public debt as a percentage of GDP for states and lower bond ratings. Now, you could say that, well, having greater debt is not necessarily bad. You can take out loans because the state or the city wants to invest in roads and bridges and things that are going to facilitate commerce. But worse bond ratings are not good for anyone, because you're just paying taxes on, or you're paying more tax revenue towards interest. So this is a rough graph, but I think it just shows you some of the trend lines here, looking at state and local debt per capita, state and local spending per capita, and state and local per capita taxes paid. And these are 2010 and 2009 figures, but it gives you a sense of the trend lines from New York being the most heavily public unionized state to Mississippi being the least. So if you're thinking about the total cost of trying to put this all together, what you end up with is that cities with collective bargaining, representing police, fire, sanitation, and street workers, tend to spend more on these activities than cities that don't bargain. And if you're looking at school districts, Caroline Hoxby at Stanford shows that collective bargaining in school districts leads to increases in total spending on schools, especially on teachers' salaries, and increases the total number of teachers. So, and finally, you can lead in some cases in cities to situations where some parts of city government is unionized and other parts aren't. And that can lead to a redirection of policy priorities insofar as the unionized sector gets bigger, gets more expensive, and that leads to shrinking of other sectors or other things that cities might do. So I won't go extensively into this. We can go into it in the question and answer if people want, but there's a longstanding debate about what's called comparative worth by economists. This is a debate about whether comparable private sector or public sector workers make more. It's a detailed and debate, but I think that my reading of both the scholarly and think tank studies and evidence suggests that there is a slight what's called premia or bonus for working in the public sector when you factor in especially pension and health benefits. Again, trying to compare workers that are apples to apples comparisons in terms of education and other factors. And these things are hard because or these comparisons are hard because there are so many workers in the public sector that don't have private sector counterparts. Comparing a New York City police officer to a mall security guard isn't a fair comparison. And even comparing a private school teacher to a public school teacher often has lots of complications as well. But I think that all told, the weight of the evidence suggests that there is a premium of a sort towards working in the public sector. Finally, another important consequence is government productivity. How much is being spent for what set of outputs? And I just put a picture of a teachers' union contract up to show you how detailed these contracts can be. Many teachers' unions contracts specify down to the minute how many minutes per day teachers have to spend with students and in what capacity those interfaces should take place. And in that regard, you can see that many contracts are developed for the terms and conditions of employment, but these kind of restrictive work rules can reduce the productivity or efficiency of what government workers are doing day to day on the job. So ultimately, the problem with these kind of restrictive work rules is that they emasculate management. This isn't always to say that management is right, but that the kind of discretion that managers in the private sector would be completely accustomed to if they ever move over to work in government are usually very surprised at what they can't do to, even if they see areas where efficiency could be gained, where productivity could be increased, they're constricted by longstanding work rules. And the most famous examples of this that get batted around in the press are usually about the unions protecting underperforming workers from being disciplined, reassigned, or dismissed. And if you followed the teachers' union strike in Chicago, clearly that was a big part of the disagreement, was about whether teachers who were lost their jobs when schools were closed in Chicago, say failing schools were closed, whether they would be automatically put at the head of the line for any new jobs that opened up in the Chicago school system, which was to help protect their long-term jobs rather than allowing principals at the other schools to decide, well, here are the best candidates. They say, no, you have to look at these ones who are coming from these other schools first, these sorts of transfer policies and protections. So some brief conclusions. You could say that as a result of public employee unionization, I think it's probably fair to say that government is less efficient and less productive than it might be. Forgive me. I think that some conclusions are that public employee unions are unique organizations at the municipal and the state level. And their effects are different than unions in the private sector, and their effects are different from what we see for other interest groups that are also trying to get their way in American politics. Second, public employee unions are a relatively new phenomenon in American political and economic life, with only about a 30 or maybe a little more 30, 35-year history in the United States. So I think, putting it all together, I'd say a strong case can be made that public sector unions distort the labor market, weaken public finances, and diminish the quality of public services. Ultimately, the benefits of public employees win for their members. And remember, this isn't to say something so negative. Their whole object is public employee unions is to win better pay, better benefits, better working conditions for their members. And in that sense, they probably do a lot of good for those that they represent. But whether those things, by winning those things, they impose costs on the larger public in terms of higher taxes, higher bond ratings, etc. So I'll leave it with that, whether public employee unions, the costs that they impose outweigh the benefits they provide to their members, and I'll take any questions you have.
Hi, I actually have two questions. The first, I'll give them to you together and then you can answer separately. The first is about the phenomenon with Rahm Emanuel in Chicago and the two bites of the apple sort of theme. Do you think that did anything, as someone who is so clearly a Democrat, so clearly someone who has been affiliated with unions, to stand up and take a fairly rigid stance against a unionized body in the way that he did during the education debate? Second question is there any study to correlate quality of what's delivered, test scores, et cetera, to unionized schools or teacher bodies, as opposed to those that aren't? So yes, there's more cost, but have we ever measured the intersection with quality?
So I'll take the questions in the order you gave them. They're both very good questions. I would say that I think partly this became an issue on the national stage in a partisan public employee unions and the costs and that they impose and so on became an issue nationally and it became a kind of partisan issue. It was Scott Walker. If you were a Republican, you backed Walker. If you were a Democrat, you were clearly against Walker and the constriction of collective bargaining in Wisconsin. But I think more broadly, even the Democrats at the state and local level and nationally have been closely aligned with the unions. Given the fiscal picture, both in the wake of the Great Recession and going forward, there's going to become a more bipartisan issue, meaning Democrats are going to be increasingly confronted with tough decisions that put them at odds with public employee unions who've often been their principal backers. So that hasn't just been Rahm Emanuel, it's been Cuomo in New York, Jerry Brown in California, and I think you'll see, and even some of the mayors in California, in San Jose and San Diego have had tough, difficult relations. So I think on that regard, I think for Rahm Emanuel, whether that helped him politically or not in Chicago remains yet to be seen.
But just for Rahm, I think he's unique. He was the head of the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee. He essentially blew away the numbers they were looking for when he was head of that. I think that puts him in a fairly different place as it relates to the unions because he relied so heavily on their support to do his work in that regard for the party. So looking at him uniquely, is that sort of a shot heard around the world in terms of that theme of two bites of the apple?
I think that's what I'm saying is that Democrats, when they find themselves in position of governing authority in cities and states, are increasingly going to find themselves, I don't want to say turning their back on their former allies, but realizing what has been happening they can't continue to sustain. It's one thing when you're head of it's not too much to say for Mr. Emanuel that partly where you stand depends on where you sit. When you're head of the Democrats' House Campaign Committee, you need the help of teachers' unions to help elect House candidates. When you're the mayor of Chicago, you need to improve Chicago schools, and that's clearly going to have another set of decisions. So to your second question, yes, there have been some studies. The Caroline Hoxby study that I mentioned does look at, and some of the work by Terry Moe at Stanford does look at, in terms of schools, at the productivity issue. And what they find is that a correlation roughly between greater unionization and, when you control for other factors, lower test scores. Now, I say that with caution because studying productivity is something for labor economists and political scientists is really hard to get at, and the results should be seen with caution. I also say that because, say a classic teachers union talking point is, well, look at Massachusetts. The teachers in Massachusetts are heavily unionized, and as a result of the NAEP test scores, Massachusetts has the best schools in the country. So what Hoxby and Moe and others are trying to say is that just because you have high levels of unionization in Massachusetts doesn't mean unionization and productivity go together. That what they're saying is if you control for other factors, Massachusetts schools without collective bargaining would be even better than they are. And states in the South that have very low levels of unionization in their public education systems and also very low test scores, the correlation isn't key. They would actually perform better without unionization as well. But again, holding those factors in abeyance in the social science models is, again, I think it's a tough exercise.
Well, how do you justify that statement in regards to the unionization of teachers when Massachusetts scores are the highest in the nation on these tests, I don't know if that's a relevant thing to look at. In Mississippi, the state that you used in your presentation, is one of the least unionized states in the country, particularly in education, has the lowest scores in the country. So you have the least unionized state in the country has the lowest scores of all states and the lowest performing educational system compared to the most unionized state in the country, which is Massachusetts, and has the highest scores. And how does that doesn't your comments didn't seem to justify it.
Right. Well,
The facts are the facts.
I agree. The facts are the facts, but it's not always quite that simple. I'll give you 2 examples. Mississippi also has the lowest levels per capita in the state, among states, of education and income. And clearly education in Massachusetts has some of the highest. So if you say, well, lots of children in Massachusetts grow up in more stable families, in families with higher levels of education and income, maybe the results of the performance of the Massachusetts schools isn't so much due to the results of the effectiveness of Massachusetts public schools, but it's due to the levels of education and income in Massachusetts, which are clearly much lower in Mississippi. The same could be said for the exercise of comparable worth. You could say if I just look at the raw numbers, on, say, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, what do I find? I'll find that it looks like, on salary terms, public employees make a lot more than their private counterparts. But I think that's actually misleading, albeit in the opposite direction, for the same reasons, because public employees tend to have much higher levels of education and experience than many of their private sector counterparts doing the same job. Once I take those things into account, I see that in fact their compensation is closer in terms of hourly terms.
But every argument you have, if you use Massachusetts and Mississippi, economic or whatever factor it is, you also look at all the other factors of Mississippi. It's the least unionized state. The salaries are far below the national average. The incomes, whether you're unionized or not, are way below would be an average income in Massachusetts. And we're still part of the same country. We're in America, and when we have a unionized state, whether it be public sector, private sector, wherever it is, or education or not education, you still have to look at the reality of the place that is unionized, the place that has higher economic standard and better educated people and more productivity is still much greater than the place that would say there is no productivity, there is no education, there is no opportunity. They're right to work states. They don't allow their employees to meet, to confer, to bargain with their employers to create what might be a better standard. Yet, because they're held down. And that is in both the private and public sector in Mississippi.
Well, I guess, partly this is about how social science questions are conducted, which means, yes, you have to start with holding those factors constant to try to look at the factor that you're trying to get at, which would be to say, in this case, collective bargaining, to start with your first example, in the public schools. Once I hold in abeyance or hold constant factors such as education and income and try to isolate the effect of collective bargaining for schools, what do I find when I isolate that effect? And what the scholarship to date has found is that it decreases productivity and it increases costs. Now, that's not to say that you still can't end up with good outcomes if you have a state with high levels of education and income. Which you can, as I think Massachusetts amply demonstrates.
How do our trends in this area compare to our countries in Europe that are having a lot of fiscal problems right now? Do you have any comparisons?
Well, in a sense, it's. I think some of the issues long term for state and local governments are. The comparison is, I think, most OECD countries are experiencing a state of austerity, which means that a lot of the promises of Western welfare states the bill is partly coming due, and they're having trouble coming up with a way to pay for it. That's certainly true in Europe, and I think it's going to be increasingly true across American states as the pension and healthcare liabilities continue to mount. and how those are going to be paid compared to without depressing economic activity. So these are difficult choices, and it's a difficult bind that both state and local governments in the United States are in, and obviously national governments in Europe are in. There's some peculiarities to the European situation because of the common currency and common market without having a common fiscal policy that don't apply to, say, American states because they're part of a single country with a common fiscal policy and monetary policy.
With the growth of pension obligations, and benefits in general, are there any states that you can point to? Are there any states that you can point to where they're doing an effective job of addressing the long-term obligations in those areas? I know in the private sector, defined benefit plans are basically a thing of the past, and I'd like to understand if there are some states that are on the leading edge of attacking that problem.
It's an excellent question. You're right. The big difference between the public and the private sector is the private sector has defined benefit pension plans have been, largely disappeared and been replaced by defined contribution plans, whereas the public sector is almost completely characterized by defined contribution plans. Defined benefit plans. A number of states, almost more than 30 states, have undertaken some kind of public employee pension reform in the last 2 years. So this is a element of legislation that is on the burner. Now, which states are really doing the best in this regard? It's hard to say. Some of the states that have taken the most aggressive action have also been in the worst position. States like Illinois or New Jersey. Other states that are pretty well funded, or at least by the common metrics, like New York, it looks good on pensions, but New York State, and especially New York City, on its health care obligations to retired public workers, is in terrible shape. Which is to say the pension scheme looks good, but New York City has an $80 billion liability for which zero has been set aside. But the choices, again, I think for these reforming public employee pensions, going forward, the choices are relatively limited. They're all controversial. They'll all be regularly opposed by public employee unions because no one wants to see retirement ages go up, benefit formulas become less generous, or contributions now increase, or switches or trying to move public employees out to more defined contribution plans. All of those policy levers that are available to address the situation are all controversial.
How you doing?
Good.
Relative to pensions, how much of the cost of local government do you believe is, you've made a case that a lot of it is going forward would be the public sector unions will be the cost. How much has been incurred over the last few decades due to mismanagement, poor management, people in bureaucratic positions, buyout, parachutes, golden parachutes for bureaucrats, public bureaucrats? We have one here for $600,000 for a city manager. And you make the comparison on the cost of the employees' pensions like New Jersey, where public employees make their benefit payment every week, while the states made no payments for them for 17 years, misusing the funds and money. What do you see as the comparison to that? A second question is, where you compare fields and you say there's not fields to compare regular things. I believe they are. I believe the majority of public employees who may fall outside of education will fall to people doing skilled labor, licensure, professional and such as librarians, trash pickup, people who bring your water system, your infrastructure. Public employees service all that, and you maintain that their skill level is much higher. When they say public employees are paid 10% higher as a rule, there aren't too many burger flippers in public employees. They're mostly skilled, licensed professionals. And where do you make your comparison for that?
I guess I'll take the second part first, and then I'll work back to the politicians. Well, the way that, again, the way labor economists try to study things is to study, when they're making comparable worth claims, is to try to compare apples to apples. They don't want to compare, for instance, someone who works, they want to compare, say, people that have similar levels of education and experience that are doing roughly the same job in the public and the private sector. Because only then are you going to be able to say one can make more or less. If I, again, my example was if I compare a New York City police officer who does a dangerous job to a security guard at a suburban mall, it's the New York City police officer, I'm willing to wager, makes more and certainly deserves to make more. He requires, or she requires, more training, more experience, and is undertaking much greater risk. So that would be an apples to oranges comparison. So what we're trying to do is find situations where there's an apples to apples one. And what I suggested is that is sometimes difficult because jobs like firemen don't often have a clear equivalent in the private sector. Police officer as well, it doesn't always have a clear comparison. That's what makes the comparable worth studies very complicated. Now you can say that on average many jobs in government happen to be more administrative and managerial and require, that is, more public employees have college degrees than people in the private sector economy. And so that's the kind of comparison or thing that, again, labor economists are going to try to take into account when they're saying who's making more, and then they've got to factor in not just who's making more in salary terms, but also in terms of pension commitments and health care. So that's what I was trying to suggest of the complications of these comparable worth studies. On the second point, I think that as far as pension and health care obligations to public employees, politicians have been equally culpable. In that sense, many politicians have seen over the years that offering a pension sweetener when they couldn't raise wages through collective bargaining was a great way to shore up their alliances with public employee unions. That, of course, imposed costs that the bill for which won't come due till they're long out of office. And in that sense, it was partly irresponsibility, maybe in some cases corruption, but you could say that the problem is that in the long term, the bill for those are now beginning to come due.
I have a comment and an observation. When I entered the workforce back in the early 70s, some of my fellow college graduates went to work for city government, and they were paid far less than I was in the private sector. And the appeal for them to take those positions was the benefits, the possibility of being able to retire. Now here we are, several decades later, and I can tell you that my counterparts in city government make far more than I do in the private sector, and their benefit package far exceeds mine, and their ability to retire at a younger age is much greater than mine. So it has clearly shifted during my work career. So in hindsight, I probably should have gone to work for city government with my fellow college graduates.
Well, I mean, partly that story is slightly borne out in just if you look at what economists measure called quit rates, which is the federal government tracks this, the rate at which people voluntarily leave their job. And if you look at the private sector, it's much, much higher than the public sector. That's because there's much more churn. People are leaving a job, getting a new one. They're trying to, move up in the world, or in a sense, do better. Whereas in the public sector, the quit rates are much lower, which would suggest, again, I don't want to try to read too much into the data, that people see the benefit as the retirement package and a kind of comfort and security with their job, and therefore, once people are hired into public employment, they tend to stay employed in public employment over the longer term of their career.
I wonder, it seems to me there's
They want you to wait for the mic.
there's a sort of a change coming, or maybe even a looming crisis, and I wonder if you have a sense for what will sort of put that crisis on the table. In other words, what are some of the events that will take place where people pay a different kind of attention to this problem than is being paid now?
Well, social scientists in general, and political science maybe in particular, are notoriously bad at predicting the future. I'm no better in that regard than an average citizen. But I would say I think we can all and should hope for a sharp and steep economic recovery, which would certainly take some of the pressure off of making, certainly on pension funds and these kind of commitments for state and especially local governments. Barring that, I think the issue is that a lot of people are going to say we're going to have to do more with less in the wake of the recession. If we continue to have relatively slow or modest economic growth, there's going to have to be increasing efforts to do more with less, which is going to mean that governors and mayors are going to run headlong increasingly into their cities' public employee unions by asking them to do more, by changing work rules that have made their day-to-day lives easier and more comfortable, by asking them to contribute more to their pensions because the stock market isn't getting the rate of return that the pension fund needs to remain solvent.
I'm going to direct my attention here to the teachers' union in education, because education now is being seen as the civil rights movement of this century. And when we talk about collective bargaining, we always measure everything in terms of dollars. And I'm just wondering if we can't avoid the opportunities offered by the economic crisis that we're facing, and looking at, and I don't know if you have any data for this, at unions who actually, teachers unions who actually engage in reform as a way of dealing with the crisis they're in. Every time a new requirement is added to the load of teachers, it's always translated into money. And I don't know if any teachers' satisfaction surveys have ever been taken, but between management, the administration, and between the collective bargaining units, teachers are caught in a crunch. And it may be in the future that people just, in spite of the benefits, are not going to go into the teaching profession. Globally, America does not get enough of a bang out of its buck that's dedicated to education. Reforms are always defined as new testing requirements instead of what actually goes on in the classroom, giving the principals, the teachers more autonomy and giving them more satisfaction out of their job. And that's one of those social science issues that perhaps gets muddled in with collective bargaining. But the strict definition of collective bargaining as to always looking for economic results rather than efficiency or satisfaction results, I think is going to get in our way. And I'm just wondering if you have seen any trends throughout the country of going beyond the very strict definition of collective bargaining and using, and unions seeing themselves as a part of the reform rather than just a dollar negotiating agent for their members, who may not always agree with them, by the way. So it's a long, convoluted question, but I'm just wondering if you see a change in the role of collective bargaining units to more substantive, productive results.
It's a very good question, and there are a lot of good pieces to it, so I'll try to just respond to a few of them. I think what you've seen over the last 20 years has been, in the politics of public education, has been an effort to introduce more choice and competition to, in part, do an end run around the collective bargaining, which was seen by many education reformers as, in part, a hopeless avenue. And clearly that's been the efforts to introduce charter schools and vouchers and other mechanisms that would spur competition inside the education sector. And that's largely been fought against politically tooth and nail by the teachers' unions. And in that sense, the number of charter schools and so on it has remained in most places in New York and so on relatively limited. It gets a lot of press, but the actual number of charter schools opened in New York and elsewhere, California, is actually pretty small compared to the number of students. As far as using collective bargaining in a different way, you hear two different things really from the two big teachers' unions. The NEA tends to be much more traditional, no change. We're performing our role as an agent representing the interests of teachers. And that's what they're charged to do, is to win benefits, whether that's salary, work rules, or health and pensions. That's what we're charged by doing with our membership. If we don't carry out those tasks through the collective bargaining and political process, we'll have an internal election inside the union and someone else will defeat us. So the NEA has been much more focused on, you could say, the bread and butter of union leadership. The AFT, which has a longer and more complicated history going back to Albert Shanker and now with Randy Weingarten as the national president, she speaks much more in terms of this, what some people have called reform unionism, which would try to use collective bargaining in a different way. And I guess my own personal view is she often sounds like they're going to do some of the things that you suggest. But I haven't actually seen much evidence that when the rubber hits the road, they actually do that. But again, I'm not a specific expert on teachers' unions, so I say that with some caution.
Excuse me, my name's Len Zalaskis, and I'm the president of the teachers union here in Worcester. It's a MTA NEA affiliate. We're the second largest pre-K to 12 educators union in New England, only behind Boston. And I have to say that, you know, I was hoping that this was going to be a micro conversation, and it's really a national conversation. Because when I look at some of your slides, at least 5 of them, I could just pick them apart for a while. But one of them, when you show, you know, a tumultuous business climate and then public sector as an island, being a teacher, that was offensive to me because it's a very, very difficult job. And I heard people comparing us to, you know, across the world. Finland, for instance, has about the same population as the state of Massachusetts. If you take the state of Massachusetts, apart from the rest of the country, we're very similar to Finland. Finland has a few things we don't have. For instance, the way that teachers are treated. They're held in high esteem over there, as opposed to over here, where it seems to be that because the economy's going bad, teachers that are easy people to beat on. In Finland, they teach religion. Religion is in all the schools. We definitely don't have that here. They don't have any high stakes testing whatsoever. In Japan, there's another country, you think about high stakes testing, they don't have it until you get out of high school. So, as I said, some of your things you had up there, 1988, 1996, I can assure you that the numbers aren't the same. Someone asked me, how would you improve schools in Worcester? I said, you need more teachers. We're down 400 or 500 teachers in the last decade. So I think while you presented this very well, you need to look at your facts closer. I think that some of your facts are way off base. And as I said, if you put your slides back up there, I can go through 4 or 5 things where I could debate you for a while. So I guess, you know, do you know what we pay for our pensions here in Massachusetts as teachers? I know you just said you were an expert at it.
Well, I guess I wasn't invited to come and give a speech about Worcester or Massachusetts in particular. I would have prepared the data had I done that, but I figured I was coming to speak to an audience that was here to. Well, I appreciate that, but I only didn't do that in part because I assumed that, you know, this was a group of local union leaders, business people, think tank people, that all of you probably know more about Worcester in particular than I do.
If you came into a school, you wouldn't think you were on an island. I can assure you of that.
Right, but remember, that's partly a shorthand to capture a broader phenomenon, which is the difference between not just teachers. And remember, I'm a college professor, so in a union, we're an AFT affiliate, so I'm intimately familiar with many of these things at the university level. And in that regard, I would say that this is also to capture the work that other people are doing, not just teachers, but all the other kinds of public employees. And here the kinds of job protections, vacation days, health benefits are much broader and more sweeping, that give a kind of protection for public employees that their private sector counterparts. And one can say that that's terrible, that that's what's happened. One could give a different spin to it. You could say, well, what we want to do, and many teachers' unions and other Democrats and other leaders have said, well, what we want to do is make the private sector look more like the public sector, partly because the public sector does have these kinds of protections and does have these kind of more defined benefit pension plans and so on that are much more predictable than a defined contribution plan. So the argument then is, well, there is two worlds of work. We just want to make the private sector look more like the public sector.
I would say globally, you're correct, but in Worcester, you're not. If you compare the amount of people who are in the district teaching, or the amount of people at, say, Hanover, some of these insurance companies, include Norton Company, Wyman Gordon's used to be here, but they're essentially in Grafton, they have equally or better benefit packages than we have. They have similar vacation time, if you want to call it vacation time. We get paid per day contract. We don't get any holiday pay or vacation pay being teachers. You could argue that point back and forth, but the fact is that these insurance companies, et cetera, they make more money than we do. The people at a lot of these big companies that are generally the same size, the hospitals, et cetera, they're doing better than we are, and that's my assessment of it.
Well, like I would say, I think the studies on comparable worth, it's a tough subject, and I'm not a labor economist, but I can only report what I see as the general findings of the scholarly literature, that if you're making those kind of comparisons to, say, somebody with an advanced degree in accounting or economics that works at a bank to someone with just a bachelor's degree that's working in school, that's not a fair comparison. You're not comparing apples to apples.
Again,
so,
I disagree again, because
I mean,
everyone has a master's degree. There's almost no one who has a bachelor's. You
right,
have
but
to have a master's
your
in
whole
the state
the
of
whole
Massachusetts by law.
the whole difference here is, I think there's some difficulty in understanding how economic and social science research is conducted, and what scholars are trying to hold constant when they make these comparisons. And of course, teachers' salaries are set on a stepwise schedule that comes from, partly negotiated through contracts, which means seniority and education levels. It's a set of steps, whereas in the private sector, it's a whole different mode, and partly that goes to the two worlds of work point, which is it's a much more competitive environment with much more managerial discretion over who earns what. But I'll leave it on that.
Thank you. I think that we have absolutely achieved our purpose in having a good dialogue about the issue, and I thank you very much for coming here and sharing this with us. And obviously, we'll have to have you back to continue the discussion. So I want to thank you all for coming, and if Professor DiSalvo, I think if you can stay for a few minutes, if there are other questions, we'd be happy to. I hope you'd be happy to entertain them. But I want to thank you all for coming, and I hope that this has been enlightening for you. And we'll see you at the next Research Bureau event. Thanks a lot.